So we've got some big drops for lesser played Tyranid units, with Warriors, Psychophages and Zoanthropes and a few more taking big points cuts. Let's talk about Tyranids going forward in 40k and how much strength they've gained from these updates. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd go over the Minotaur and Field manual points changes for the faction, taking a look at each unit in turn, how impactful the change is, and where it might leave the Tyranids from now. Before the balance data slate, I would have said that Tyranids are one of the more struggling armies in Warhammer 40k. Win rates of around about 45% or so. They maybe weren't doing too badly directly after their codex launch, but seem to have deteriorated a bit since then. They did take a couple of nerfs to some of their best units in the last balance update, even if they got some boosts to some other things. The main issues for the army at the moment is that they're overly dependent on things like battle shock, lone operative tricks, and scoring with biovore spore mines, or to make up for a bit of a loss of raw power versus the enemy, generally having to play with fairly maximal objective scoring shenanigans to achieve the wins that they do have. Otherwise, they tend to really struggle with dealing with big heavily armoured targets, things like knights or any sort of heavy vehicle type army. Often their preferred damage dealers are things like exocrines and maleceptors, both of which are sort of slightly mid-ish strength. The Tyranids don't really have very much in the way of efficient units that wounds toughness 10 stuff on a 3. Armies seem to be having the most success with Invasion Fleet, with Synaptic Nexus, Unending Swarm and Vanguard Onslaught also seeing play. But in general, the army does seem to be on the scope of the 40k power spectrum where they need a bit of help versus the competition. Last time in their balance update, they had nerfs to a couple of units like the new Lictor, Death Leaper and Gargoyles, all of which still get played on top lists. But they did receive a few boosts, things like the Screamer Killer and the Tyrannifex, which are a bit more usable than they were. The Tyrannifex with the Acid Spray is alright for a bit of Overwatch. Getting into the changes this time round though, and first up we've got the Tyranid Warriors. They definitely stick out as one of the Tyranid units that's needed help since the edition started, just flat overcosted for what they do in terms of damage and defense. The melee weapon warriors went down from 85 points to 75, so that's really quite a serious percentage drop of 12% decrease to these guys, though in general they were coming from points where they were really quite niche. Their mass strength 5, AP2 and damage 1 attacks with twin linked do blend most infantry really quite well, but they will struggle against tough stuff that they might be wounding on a 5 or 6. Perhaps their biggest issue though was they're just not really all that tough for the cost. Most things can kill them really quite easily. Their toughness 5, 4+ save profile with 3 wounds is basically a profile that just about any weapon will be fairly okay against. Both lasguns and lascannons have alright efficiency against them, and damage 3 things are kind of optimal. And if they are a bit pricey for that defensive profile, they're just going to be fragile against literally every enemy. With a good points cut though, I feel like it's probably changed them from being kind of bad to more usable or mid. They do have fairly cheap synapse, and their damage output genuinely isn't bad for this cost at this point. Still, probably the biggest issue is the defense. It's no longer awful for the cost, though it's still not standout. Maybe in a place where they're going to be a bit more tempting in casual games, but I'm not sure how much they'll be played in competitive so far. Otherwise, we've got the Warriors with ranged weapons. They're down to 65 from 70, not quite as big a percentage decrease as the others, but they were already cheaper. I feel like they were actually at least somewhat kind of well balanced between the two. These guys are nice in having the Venom Cannon, plus a little bit of infantry killing fire, but the melee is only really particularly good against lighter infantry with less AP and no twin linked. Again, I feel like they're maybe kind of well balanced against the melee version now. 23 points or so per model isn't really all that much. Might be getting to the point where they're at least somewhat sturdy-ish for the cost at 3 wounds, toughness 5 and their 4+ save, and could be okay objective scrappers for things fighting on the mid board, though I feel like you might have to weigh them up against things like Gaunts for a bunch of objective control. Barbgaunts dropped down a bit. They were 60 points in the last update and are now down to 55. I feel like they were kind of rarely played, mainly because Tyranids tend to struggle against the tougher things in the enemy army, so buying in more dedicated sort of counter infantry like these guys maybe wasn't quite as common. For sort of like line infantry to fight against other line infantry, they're not awful though. They've got lots of blast fire and 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 4+ save is okay for 11 points. They perhaps really come into their own either against enemy units that have got a big slow unit that's worth slowing down with the blast weapon, or if they can draw a bead on some sort of big 20-man unit where they get multiple stacking copies of blast. I'm not sure that dropping a few points really changes things crazily for these guys. Might still be in the area where you might take 1 unit if you want to be able to threaten that special rule against the right opponents, I'm sure in the odd game that you play where you're playing against horde units, their firepower could be pretty efficient there. The single biggest winner in terms of percentage decreases, though, was the Psychophage, the great big witch devouring tick bug from the Leviathan box set and the Start Collecting sets went down from 125 all the way down to 95. Really quite a massive 24% decrease there, that was considered very, very overcosted before. It's really quite sturdy with the 10 wounds that it gets with a 5+ feel no pain, that on average it means that you'll have to shoot down around about 15 wounds worth of Psychophage to be able to take one out. But it really just doesn't do all that much on the damage front. Even if it does get into melee against Psychers, I still feel like it gets to the point where it's alright as opposed to actually good damage. I think the main draw to bringing a Psychophage along is to give a 6+ feel no pain aura to other Tyranids out there. Maybe not quite so effective on things like 1 wound infantry, where any multi-damage attack is going to make that completely irrelevant, but might be quite nice if you've got some other monsters to support. Maybe things like Exocrines or Maleceptors in a detachment that isn't just the invasion fleet, where you might be a bit more tempted to use the 5+ feel no pain on them. I feel like if we can give his boost to a good enough section of your army, and save a few wounds of monster being lost to enemy fire, at 95 points, it doesn't seem awful that what's left over is just a cheap and tough nuisance monster that realistically isn't going to do much damage, but could certainly get in the way and might kill 1 or 2 medium infantry a turn. I still feel at 95 points it might be kind of borderline for that sort of role though, as opposed to standout auto-include or anything. Seems pretty good news for those folks that might have 3 of these guys from the Leviathan box set though. They're really cheap and easy models to acquire second hand, say on eBay and things right now. And at more casual levels, throwing 3 of them into the army for 300 points to be sort of distraction Carnifex sort of models doesn't actually seem like the worst thing in the world. They're perhaps a monster that looks like a lot more threat than they actually are, and they might have absorbed quite a lot of firepower that could have been going against the more scary and dangerous bugs. Next up, we've got the psychic horrors that are the Zoanthropes. They drop down to 100 points from 110. I'd say previously they were usable but not standout at 110 points, I think. If you wanted Tyranid firepower, then Maleceptors or Exocrines tended to be the ones to go for with their big damage 3 attacks, plus just being a bit more resilient to enemy return fire with the big monster profiles, as opposed to the toughness 5 and relying on the 4+ invulnerable. I think the Zoanthropes are maybe most interesting in Synaptic Nexus, where they basically get a few las cannon shots with lethal hits at 24 inches, with reroll ones to hit and wound with their stratagem. I think that 100 points does make them a lot more interesting though, and Tyranids are definitely crying out for any sort of effective anti-tank unit. I still wouldn't say they're enormously tough for the cost, but a 4+ invulnerable does mean that they could weather attacks that other things might perish to, and they can be at least somewhat flexible with a blast mode to take out heavy infantry with. Otherwise, they can also threaten to drain mortal wounds situationally if you fail a battle shot close to them, and they provide synapse and a weak invulnerable save. None of those really feel like they're the core thing that you buy the unit in for, but might be just nice enough peripheral benefits on some nice shooty lance attacks moving up the board. Next up, we've got the Hive Guard that also dropped down to 100 points from 110. Unlike the Zoanthropes, though, I feel like these guys weren't borderline usable, they were just outright bad. Again, for Tyranid firepower, far more people using Maleceptors or Exocrines than these guys, as they were just better against most targets, as well as being more mobile, and maybe the toughness is a bit of a side grade. I think unlike Zoanthropes, they're still not going to be very exciting at 100 points, probably needed to go down further than that. Their defensive profile is quite tanky with 4 wounds and high toughness, but the damage output just isn't that great. The shot cannons get the nice anti-vehicle thing, but low AP really doesn't help them there. When you could be saving on a 2+ save in cover, then they're not going to get that many damage results through. The Impaler cannons could give you a little bit of indirect fire, but only AP 1 and damage 1 does sort of limit the potential on those things. The Overwatch stratagem is fun, maybe on a maximal unit of shot cannons they might be worth it, though I feel like most detachments have better places to spend their CP than that. Overall, I'd say they're probably just not quite where they need to be at that points cost, probably a little bit lower still. I'd still be more tempted by the Maleceptors, Exocrines, or Zoanthropes now. They're chunky brothers in the Tyrant Guard to shield the Hive Tyrants from attack, get a points cut down from 95 for 3 down to 85. They're the ones that the Hive Tyrant or the Neuro Tyrant can attach to, but it seemed that the vast majority of competitive lists tended to prefer running their Hive Tyrant solo when they took one, and then generally just hiding behind terrain when they needed to against heavy firepower, farming out things like the Feel No Pain stratagem in invasion fleets, and then maybe trying to commit to the battle a little bit later after you've already had some good value from that, rather than striding up the field with Tyrant Guard. I feel like that kind of points cut is genuinely quite impressive though. They've gone down to 28 points per model for 4 wounds at toughness 8 and a 3+ save, which is genuinely very durable. They're going to need basically anti-tank firepower or concentrated special weapons to take them out, and 12 wounds at that kind of profile for just 85 points really is quite nice, particularly when they come in 3 individual Tyrant Guard, so you might get some overkill reducing enemy damage further. I don't think they seem too bad on paper now, combined with the Hive Tyrant or maybe even the Swarmlord marching up the board. Feels like you can near enough double their durability for a fraction of the points cost, which is maybe one of the issues with those guys, that they're kind of useful for their datasheet abilities and their damage output to a slightly lesser extent, but a bit of a liability and quite easy to kill for the points cost. Seems like they could be really quite tanky with a Psychophage with Feel No Pain or getting cover from Zoanthropes perhaps. And they're kind of interesting for a couple of the slightly lesser used attachments, Synaptic Nexus, where they can be a really big and chunky synapse unit for any effects to go off on, or maybe Assimilation Swarm when you can threaten to resurrect Tyrant Guard, one of the bigger and more threatening profiles that you can just return to the board. They do genuinely seem just a little bit more interesting at this points cost than they were. Next up, we've got the Lictor that dropped down to 55 points from 60. Again, a pretty decent percentage drop there, down 8% on a unit that I thought was pretty usable already. Perhaps the main issue for the Tyranids is that they're sort of spoilt for choice with really good lone operatives. They've got the Lictor at 80 points, which is quite tanky and doesn't do much damage, but does have genuinely nice battle shock things, and can buff the Tyranids against one unit with the +1 to wound thing. And Death Leaper gets his great invulnerable save and better toughness, as well as more battle shock shenanigans. Those guys were still being regularly played in just about every competitive Tyranid list for the most part. Lictors maybe cropped up a bit more occasionally, the main selling points being that they're cheaper and get a free rapid ingress if you want it, so that can be kind of powerful to put them on the board in the enemy turn and then have a very short, pretty much guaranteed charge in yours. Overall, I think just objectively they're just a very strong unit for 55 points. A cheap, fast, dangerous, and tough to kill lone operatives are almost always going to have good value, even if there's good competition. Fights first can make them kind of tough to deal with for more melee focused armies where they might go down swinging. And if you just want some screening or a cheap model to put on a mid-board objective, they can just be a really cheap infiltrating unit as well. They do seem like there's lots of good ways to get value out of them depending on the army that you're facing, and I feel like 1 or 2 in an army isn't going to be a bad choice. It really does feel like you could run a pretty Lictor heavy force very credibly at the moment. Maybe just the downside is that if you take too many lone operatives, you might be robbing yourself a bit of damage punch overall, and they don't really have all that much OC for objectives either. Finally, for the points buffs, we've got the Swarmlord. He was certainly one that Tyranid players were requesting to go down in cost quite a bit. He dropped down to 240 points from 270, though previously really was considered pretty overcosted. He farms 1 command point per turn, so you get your free CP there. He ruins 1 enemy battle tactic stratagem after they've used it, so increases the cost. It's got a slightly boosted synapse range, and then beyond that it's just got a nice torrent psychic shooting and a whole bunch of twin-linked bone saber attacks. At 240 points, I'm still not convinced that he's going to be standout, even with those very nice abilities. It might be enough to get him from being fairly bad to at least somewhat usable though, even if I'd still probably not expect to see him in most competitive lists or anything like that. In general, I think you'd want to keep him safe for at least a turn or 2 and make sure he doesn't die while you generate command points in the early game, and then aim to slam into the enemy and get his melee profile to work a little bit later. Feels like he could be a good combo with a Tyrant Guard for, say, 325 points for a fairly tanky unit with a fair bit of general purpose melee threat. Might not be the worst way to run him if you want to. Finally, for the points changes, we have the 1 nerf for the Tyranids. Gargoyles went up to 85 points from 80. They'd also got a points increase in the last update, but it hadn't really done them any harm. Still pretty excellent, as very fast moving objective control to chaff that are great for primary objectives, and then move shoot move makes them doubly interesting. Means that they can go up the board really quite quickly and threaten big first turn move blocks to keep an entire enemy army pinned into their deployment zone for a turn. Or they could drop in via deep strike and then get a move after they've deep struck in, potentially getting to places that you wouldn't normally be able to do secondary objectives, or even stealing an objective if the opponent deployed right on the edge of it. They're good in Vanguard Onslaught with the right keywords, and Unending Swarm where you could potentially repeatedly respawn 20 of them if you wanted. In general, they were still a unit where lists were often using 1 or 2 units of them for the good value there, but maybe not over-investing. I feel like for that role, it's not really going to change too much, them going up to 85. Still seem like a pretty nice unit to have in the army, Might discourage people from spamming them a little bit more though, I guess. Now that a couple of balance passes have gone past, I feel like Games Workshop have broadly gotten around to hitting most of the really bad stuff in the codex with at least 1 point's decrease. Maybe here are just a few of the ones that might be nice for further drops. There's a few things that Games Workshop just seem unlikely to touch. The Harpy, Hive Crone, Spore Mines, Mucilid, and Spore Assist all seem to be in the category where they're sort of deliberately being kept bad. They seem to have a policy on flyers in keeping them niche, and the Spore Mines and Spore Assist are just clearly costed in no way in line with their abilities. There's a fair amount of other stuff that still feels weakish. I feel like the Morlock could probably use going down a bit. The Norn Assimilator will be a helpful unit to actually get genuinely efficient, given that it's good at anti-tank. And the Toxicrin still feels like you're paying too much for it at 150. It's just not general purpose enough with those anti-infantry sort of toxic lashes. Beyond that, there just feels like there's a whole load of the codex that's usable but not really stand out great. Perhaps it might not have been the worst idea just to give Tyranids some general and sweeping small points cuts across the board. They're definitely a faction that could afford to just gain a little bit of raw power even to some of their good units. I don't think it would make them problematic. Overall for these changes, I'd say that these are a small step in the right direction for Tyranids' overall power level. It might certainly help out plenty of players who are playing perhaps at a less optimised level, and in casual games a lot of units that you might be running like Psychophages did genuinely get far better. Though I do feel like maybe the theme of a lot of these is generally sort of mediocre units getting a little bit less mediocre, as opposed to any sort of standout good stuff that looks like it's really going to be the new thing for Tyranids. I wouldn't be too surprised if a few competitive lists really remain very similar to how they were, maybe trying out one or more of these newer units that have gone down in cost. The Gargoyle nerf isn't huge, but it also isn't helpful, will cost just a few more points for the list that want to run them, and I think that people still will. 10 points on a 2000 point army isn't the most big deal in the world though. Otherwise, for interesting stuff, I feel like the Lictor at 55 points really does look pretty great. You could easily run multiple of those if you wanted, and just have loads of lone operatives to annoy, distract, and disrupt the foe, though you might get into diminishing returns as mentioned. Zoanthropes look like they're genuinely alright anti-tank again, maybe best in Synaptic Nexus, but just nice to have a whole load of lethal hits las cannons at 24 inches when you need them. The Psychophage for 95 points, I think people aren't convinced it's going to be standout so far, but I think it is looking alright as a cheap and tough chaff monster that could add a little bit of durability to the rest of your army and then just generally get in the way and cause issues. You might be better off in a detachment that doesn't have quite as easy access to Feel No Pain though. Otherwise, beyond that, Warriors, the Swarmlord and the Tyrant Guard all look usable but probably not standout, I'd say. They feel like units that you could probably make work with a bit of clever play if you wanted to. I'm sure some people will enjoy trying them out at their lower values. In any case, let me know what you're thinking about experimenting with. How do you feel like these buffs have helped the Tyranids? If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and as ever, if you were thinking about picking up any 40k miniatures, you can do so at a discount rate with the links in the video description, and save a good amount of money versus the Warhammer web store direct. Otherwise, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.